What is up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Equestrian Physio on Air. I'm your host, Katie. I am a Canadian physiotherapist and a strength and conditioning coach for equestrians. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about mounting from the ground, because often I will put out posts showing different biomechanical breakdowns about, certain demands in riding. And one of those is occasionally things involving mounting from the ground. And I do this because for a lot of riders, they struggle with the physicality required to both get their leg up in the stirrup and then the strength to get up there without, hauling themselves up like a sack of potatoes. And it's really limiting, and it makes them fearful of going out on a hack or a hunter pace or anything where they might have to get down to get a gate or fetch a lost shoe or crop or anything like that. And so they avoid it simply because of that fear. I also think personally that getting on from the ground is a good kind of litmus test of rider fitness. So do you have the mobility to get your leg up to the stirrup? Do you have the strength, the single leg strength to get your body up in a somewhat athletic capacity where you're not just hauling yourself on the saddle or on your horse's mane? Can you do it from both sides? I know, gasp, getting on from the right, but it is really something that I think all riders should be able to do. Now, that being said, I realize there are going to be anatomical constraints. Like if you have someone who is 5'1" trying to get on an 18-2 warm blood, that might be reaching the limit of what that person can reasonably do. But that said, stirrups can always drop down. There are a lot of ways that you can do it. You can put your horse on a downhill. There are ways to make it accessible, even if you are a shorter rider riding a taller horse. But I do understand that there are kind of anatomical limitations in how far a person's hip can flex and how high a stirrup can be. And I guess without further ado, let's roll the tape. Hey, I'm Katie. I'm a physiotherapist, strength and conditioning coach, and lifelong rider dedicated to helping equestrians build strong, capable, resilient bodies, both in and out of the saddle. This podcast is here to empower riders of all levels with evidence-informed rehab, training, and education. And we're not just here to follow tradition for tradition's sake. We're here to challenge outdated norms and bring critical thinking and curiosity to how we train, ride, and show up. Let's get into it. So today I wanted to dive into the tradition of mounting from the ground. And this is a hot topic in the equestrian world. When I post, again, any of these videos that are breaking down the mechanics or showing different ways to kind of train yourself to handle the demands of mounting from the ground, I always get in the comments a million, backlash where it's okay, that's so bad for your horse's back. That's going to twist your saddle tree. You're hurting your horse. You're an evil rider. I'm not kidding. It gets a little bit extreme sometimes. And so what I wanted to do today is dive into, when it comes to mounting from the ground, what do we actually know? What is potentially a little bit of a polarized view overall? What does the research tell us? What does kind of mechanics tell us? What can we lean into? And then where does our gaps in our knowledge lie? And this is when, in the intro, when I talk about coming at things from a critical lens and really trying to approach the way that we interpret a lot of these traditions, a lot of these dogmas in the equestrian industry with a critical lens, this is what I mean. Because it seems that in the equestrian world, and again, I am looking at this through the bias of the comments that I get when I post these types of videos, but through that lens, it seems that everyone has a very polarized view of what is okay and what is not. And we need to be critical of that. And we need to look at what the evidence tells us and be curious if the evidence isn't that clear. So a little bit of a history lesson. If you don't know, most of us get on from the left side. And there is a reason for that. It's a tradition that dates back many centuries, and it's mainly coming from military history, where soldiers would wear their swords on their left hip, mostly because most of them were right-handed or were forced to be right-handed. And so as they were mounting, they would mount with the left leg on the left side to avoid having to swing their sword over their horse's back, potentially getting tangled. It was just a much more fluid motion. However, that practice has stuck. And so now it seems to be so ingrained in the industry that horses are trained to primarily accept riders mounting from the left. Most riders have only mounted from the left in their entire time riding. It's something that's trained as tradition in Pony Club. And it really is just a fundamental piece of the industry. So it's really stuck. But how often do we stop and ask, is that the best choice biomechanically? or has this tradition just kind of outpaced what's actually best for the horse? So we're going to dive a little bit into the evidence here. Now, when people come at me and say, okay, mounting from the ground is bad for the horse's back, we need to be critical and say, what evidence do we actually have for that? And so we're going to talk about the studies that we have looking at, the pressure that is exerted through the horse's back. We're going to look at any evidence that we have on how this actually impacts the horse's back and spine over long term. We're maybe going to touch a little bit on like rider technique and fitness levels and how those things play into it, the sidedness and the asymmetry piece of it, and how spines and or other tissues surrounding them can adapt to load. And that's all going to feed into like, okay, what do we actually know? What can we say for certain? What can't we say? Where can we get curious? And what do we still need evidence on? So when it comes to the biomechanics of things, research has quantified that like significant forces are exerted on the horse's back when the rider mounts from the ground. And not surprisingly, when you use a mounting block or assistance like a leg up, these forces are dramatically reduced. There was a landmark study which used pressure mats, and most people will be familiar with this. I think it was in about 2008, 2009, if I'm correct here, that found that mounting from the ground produced significantly higher forces on the horse's back compared to the mounting block, even when they were normalized to rider weight. The peak pressure is typically concentrated on the right side, which makes sense if people are getting on from the left, of the horse's withers. So we have that kind of peak pressure coming into the right of the horse's withers. It can be about double the person's body weight in terms of the force going through that when you're mounting from the ground. When we have this lateral pull, again, horses are kind of oriented front to back, and so they're much more stable in the front to back plane than they are the side to side, so then they have to shift to avoid getting unbalanced. Often that means they'll take a step. So they alter their posture to handle that rider mounting. But if we use a mounting block, it can significantly cut down those peak forces. It doesn't mean those peak forces aren't still there, but it's quite a lot less than mounting from the ground. The taller the mounting block, the less force going through the horse's back. So we know that in a single kind of pressure mat study, mounting from the ground creates a large asymmetric load on the horse's back. And I think I've even read somewhere that it's kind of equivalent to a horse landing from like a 1.35 meter jump or like double the rider's body weight. Now, keep in mind that that is a single event. We have pressure studies showing that peak force. But we also need to remember that bones, muscles, ligaments, tendons, soft tissues, the bodies in general have this lovely capacity to adapt. Biological tissues can adapt to regular loading, right? Both horse and human bodies are not made of glass. They become stronger and more resilient when they are gradually conditioned to handle certain forces. We know in human studies that according to something called Wolff's Law, bone remodels and increases the density along lines of stress. We also know that powerlifters and weightlifters can have really high bone mineral density because their skeletons have adapted to the demands of lifting heavy over time. We also know that intervertebral discs, which are the shock-absorbing discs that live between the vertebrae, newer evidence suggests that runners actually can have like healthier, more hydrated discs and even thicker disc tissues compared to less active individuals. So we know that a lot of spinal tissues can remodel when exposed to load, and usually in a positive way. So how does this actually relate to mounting horses? So it potentially suggests that if mounting from the ground is introduced slowly, progressed, and managed appropriately, potentially the horse's back could adapt to those repeated loads to some degree. A high degree of force when mounting from the ground doesn't necessarily equal wear and tear or injury. There is capacity for adaptation there. However, the key here is that we want to look at gradual conditioning and symmetry. If we're always only mounting from the left side, odds are things are going to adapt, but potentially in an imbalanced way, which may not be ideal. We also need to look at this in terms of how injuries tend to occur. And we know, especially in human literature and, me being in the rehab sciences, injury occurs when a sudden load exceeds what a tissue is accustomed to. So arguably, it could be said that if we practice progressively mounting from the ground, we build up the horse's tolerance to it. If and when we actually have to expose the horse's back to those forces, and, the rider themselves, the horse's back has been prepared to handle that. And so it's not like, okay, you never mount your horse from the ground. Suddenly they toss a shoe out on a hack. You have to get down and you get up. I would argue that the likelihood of causing injury or straining the horse's back in that sense, or the rider straining themselves in that sense, would be higher simply because it's not something that's practiced. But if you are spending most of your time mounting from the mounting block, but a couple times a week you mount from the ground, alternating signs, and you've progressed that over time, then the one-off time you have to get on from the ground during a hack or whatever, the horse has been conditioned to be able to handle that. But I think it's also important to note that biological adaptation has its limits too. We see this in maladaptive adaptations from a tissue standpoint as well. If we have excessive loading or poorly managed progression, it can overshoot the adaptive capacity of what a tissue can handle, and that can cause injury or damage. So if you have like an abrupt, heavy torsional load on the spine, that has been known to cause disc injury in humans. And so potentially the same could happen in horses. So the goal is to, if we are training this, keep the forces within a range that the horse can tolerate and slowly build. For example, I would say like in younger horses, mounting from a mounting block would be pretty essential. Like we don't want to expose them to these high torsional forces if their bodies aren't ready for that. But I also potentially look at this as if we slowly progress the height of the mounting block, bring it down, mount from both sides with good technique in an athletic way, and progress the horse's tolerance to that, they should be able to adapt in a positive way by building up more strength, bone density, tissue quality, whatever, to be able to handle that. And that way, if it comes up where you have to mount from the ground in one reason or another, whatever the situation is, the horse is prepared and it's not this all of a sudden novel stimulus that might cause injury. So the next thing is do we have any data that mounting unilaterally, so just from the left side, and mounting from the ground repeatedly over time actually causes damage to the horse's back? From my research, and I am happy if anyone else wants to correct me, toss it in the comments. I'd be interested really if anyone knows of any studies, but I haven't been able to find any peer-reviewed literature that has directly tracked horses progressively over the years to see if there's any back pathology for horses that are regularly mounted from the ground compared to horses that are mounted from a block. I know it has been postulated from a lot of veterinarians and equine clinicians that repeatedly mounting from the ground might cumulatively create pain or tissue damage over time, but I, again, don't know if we actually have study to say that. I know we have some postural studies out there from what I remember. We know that school horses have a very high rate of back disorders, and one could argue that school horses are probably the most subjected to poor mounting techniques, whether from the ground or from a mounting block. They probably get hauled on the most because they're exposed to riders who just aren't that good at it yet. But that's not necessarily from mounting too. They're also exposed to riders who aren't necessarily that good at riding yet either, which means that the horse or the rider is going to be in conflict with the horse's movement more often, pounding on the horse's back more aggressively, and that could potentially cause issues. So it's not just the mounting that we can look at here. We also need to think about how the rider's technique influences this as well. If you watch a jockey getting a leg up, there's no strain on the saddle. That jockey's just up and in the saddle with hardly any impact on the horse. Versus you go to your average local dressage show and you're going to see all kinds of techniques. You're going to see people who are getting up nice and lithe and athletic, and you're going to see people who need a significant hand and are hauling on the saddle, hauling on the horse's mane, and probably plopping down pretty heavily as well. So we need to think about how this impacts the horse as well. If we have an athletic, coordinated rider, that can minimize the strain. So if you have a really athletic rider who can push off the ground very quickly, get their leg up very quickly, and swing over into the seat and land softly, odds are that's going to put very minimal strain on the horse's back. But if you have a less fit or a more uncoordinated rider with a weaker push off, and they're using their arms and their stirrups to pull themselves up, they're kind of climbing up, and then they plop down on their way down, that's going to put a lot more forces through the horse's back. So even if we're using a mounting block, if we're clumsy, if we're kicking the horse in the ass, if we are hauling ourselves up, that can jar the horse just as much as an agile rider getting on from the ground, probably even more. So it's not just about the level of, or the height at which you're mounting the horse from. It's also about how athletically you're actually getting in the saddle and how softly you're landing in as well. I'd also argue too that, the long-standing tradition of mounting from the left side is probably way more problematic than just mounting from the ground in general, especially when we look at the saddle as well. Now, again, I don't know if there's any studies per se on this, but if you talk to any saddle fitter, right, a lot of the time torsion through the tree over time can lead to a twisted tree, can lead to wear and tear in our equipment. Because, while the horse can adapt biologically and their tissues can adapt to different forces, A saddle's not alive. If you keep twisting a saddle one way over and over and over again, that saddle's not going to adapt. It's just going to become twisted eventually, right? So I think that we need to look at the big picture here and not just assume that one thing is blanketly good or bad. We do have data to quantify the forces that the horses are exposed to when mounting from the ground versus a mounting block. And this does consistently show that mounting from the ground causes that higher peak pressure and asymmetric loading through the horse's back. We also actually have some evidence to show that, rider height, fitness level, block height, etc., like these things are going to help with or harm with the amount of force that is going through the horse's back. But what we don't have is evidence firmly supporting that there is a link between mounting from the ground and long-term injury or pathological development in horses, right? We have no longitudinal studies, as far as I know, that are showing that link. So it does potentially stand to reason that reducing the strain through the horse's back by using a mounting block is good overall. We need to acknowledge that we don't actually have proof for that, and we also need to keep in mind that as biological beings, horses have the capacity to adapt if loaded progressively, given sufficient recovery time, and ideally kept symmetrical in the forces that they're exposed to. So what does this actually mean? Like, what should we actually move forward with if we're thinking through this from a critical standpoint? Well, personally, I would argue that never mounting your horse from the ground potentially does more harm than good, because if you come to a situation where you do have to mount from the ground, you may not physically be capable as a rider because you never practice it, and it might be an easy way to overload your horse because they're never used to it, right? If we always coddle it, it's never actually going to build the resilience to handle those types of situations. So my advice would be, we use a mounting block whenever possible, right? Something that is going to reduce the force going through the horse's back, spare that unnecessarily pocket of force that goes into their right withers, or using a leg up if we have it available to us. But at the same time, I would recommend conditioning your horse to be able to handle getting on from the ground, which also means conditioning yourself to be able to get on from the ground, right? I see it as a safety thing, as well as, again, it's a nice litmus test for rider fitness, but you're always going to come into situations where you have to get on from the ground. You have to get a gait. You have to get the last shoe. And there's not always a rock available. There's not always someone who can get down and give you a leg up. So having that skill is useful. So if you're starting a young horse, mounting from a mounting block would be ideal, but progressively lowering that occasionally, like once or twice a week, while alternating sides so that we're exposing them symmetrically to these forces and building up the capacity to handle it. And then if you have a mature horse, getting on from the ground maybe once a week, alternating sides so that they keep up that resilience to handle it. And if and when you have to do it, it's not a surprise to them. I would also recommend looking at our own fitness, right? As riders, can we get on athletically, smoothly, lightly? We want to be springy. We want to be able to get on with minimal torque. We want to be able to do it without holding or grabbing onto the pommel or cantle and twisting the whole saddle over. And we want to be able to land softly. That means practicing single leg strength, practicing deep squats, practicing plyometrics and hopping and jumping so that you can get your body like spring up, and practicing being able to control those forces and land, and doing it from both sides. I would also recommend that, just again, thinking of saddle twisting forces, stuff like that. If someone is available to hold your opposite stirrup, that's a useful thing, very likely. Keeping your saddle in good repair, checking your tree, all those kinds of things. And overall, just making sure that everyone's in good condition. So yeah, I know that this is a little bit of a controversial topic, but I would really encourage everyone who's kind of listening through this to be really critical about a lot of these things that are traditional or that are seen as, black and white, right or wrong in our industry, because there is a lot of nuance to it. It's not just mounting from the ground is bad. It is, okay, we have evidence to say that there are significant forces that go through the horse's spine, but is that bad? Do we have evidence that that's bad? Do we have evidence that it causes pathology or degenerative spinal changes over time? Do we have evidence comparing super athletic riders to less athletic riders, right? Ask these questions, think critically, put the big picture together, but also remember to train for those kind of what-if scenarios, because you need to be able to handle them when they come up. Anyways, thanks for listening. If this sparks something, if it's controversial, if you want your opinion to be known, if you have even research that I might have missed, I would love to hear from you. Send me a message, send this episode to a friend, share it with your barn crew, and if you have some time, because this is still a newer podcast, rate and review. I would be super appreciative if you can throw some stars in there. 5 would be wonderful, but I will appreciate anything you guys throw out. Anyways, until next time, take care, guys.